All right, welcome back to Unit 6. This is our last video. Sorry, not our last video. We are going to do um, a caveat into the Civil War, but this is our last era of good feelings video. We are looking at Jackson. Last time we left off, we talked about, um, sorry, lost my place. We talked about nullification and the tariff of abominations. And now we're going to be looking at um, Jackson's aggressive policy towards Native Americans, the Indian removal policy. So, in his first inaugural address in March 1829, President Jackson promised, "It will be my sincere and constant desire to observe toward the Indian tribes within our limits a just and liberal policy, and to give that humane and considerate attention to their rights and their wants, which is consistent with the habits of our government and the feelings of our people." But what he pursued when it came to Native American policies were anything but just or liberal. And that showed a remarkable lack of humane and considerate attention of their rights and wants. So, even before Jackson took office, the United States had discussed moving all Indian tribes in the east to the lands west of the Mississippi River and east of the Rockies. To them, such a policy seemed fair, since it wanted the Indian lands and did not want the western lands yet. The Indians were understandably less impressed with the fairness of this idea. When he took office, Jackson pursued his Indian removal policy vigorously. At his urging, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act of 1830 that authorized such actions. And as a result, during his administration, no less than 94 treaties were made with the Indians, some of them forcibly. These treaties were seen as legal justification for what they were doing, moving the Indians westward and opening Indian land in the east to white settlement. um, Not all Native Americans responded meekly, though. Some responded with violence. In 1832, a group of Sauk and Fox Indians under Chief Black Hawk crossed the Mississippi back into northern Illinois to reclaim their land. A force of regular soldiers and Illinois militia moved to intercept the Indians, and the result was the Black Hawk War. It was brief but bloody, as with most conflicts between the U.S. and Native Americans, and the Native Americans suffered more and lost the war. But a more challenging war that the United States faced was the Seminole War. This is like 1835 to 1842. The Seminoles were a tribe out in Florida, and they were led by the very clever Osceola, also Osceola, and he led his troops to hide in the swamplands and marshes of Florida, as the American troops tried really in vain to track them down. They had many battles and skirmishes, and over 1,500 Americans and an unknown number of Native Americans died in the conflict. Most Seminoles were captured and sent west, but some hid in Florida until the government gave up and left them in peace. The Cherokees in the in the southeastern United States tried a different approach to their dealings with American settlers. They adopted many features of white civilization. They built communities with roads and schools and developed prosperous farms using European methods of agriculture. Many also converted to Christianity, and there was a brilliant Cherokee named Sequoyah, and he even developed a written Cherokee alphabet, allowing the Indians to publish newspapers and put the Bible in their own language. Um, and they believed the earlier promises contained in the treaties that they would be left to govern themselves if they assimilated. Um, they, f- but they soon found that the government had other plans. Now, the Christian missionaries to the Cherokee tribe were their strongest defenders. The leaders of the mission boards that supported many of these missionaries petitioned Congress and wrote many newspaper articles in support of the Cherokees' rights. And in response, the Georgia legislature passed a law targeting missionaries. It forbade white people to live among the Cherokees without government approval, and several missionaries were arrested for continuing their ministry among the Cherokees without this governmental approval. Two were even sentenced to serve 4 years hard labor in a state prison. These two, Samuel Worcester and Elijah Butler, appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the missionaries. So there's a court case called Worcester versus Georgia, and Chief Justice John Marshall ordered Georgia to release the missionaries and also told President Jackson to send troops into Georgia to remove white settlers who had moved on to the Cherokee lands. But Georgia and President Jackson ignored the court. And Jackson reportedly said, John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it, which is a comment on him not seeing his responsibility as the executive to enforce what the judicial interprets. Many Cherokees still resisted, but by 1838, troops had forcibly moved those who had not already gone west to the Indian Territory, which is now what we call Oklahoma. They dragged them from their homes, sometimes at gunpoint. They placed them in detention camps until the marches west began. And these forced marches west began in the summer, and sickness and drought killed many of the travelers. And several groups waited until fall, but heavy rain became a problem. Travel was difficult, food was scarce, winter was frigid, and bad water caused disease. About 4,000 of the 15,000 Cherokees died en route to the Indian Territory. The sick, the aged, and the very young suffered the most, and the Indians called this relocation the Trail of Tears. And it's perhaps the saddest event in the Indian settlement process. The forced removal of 10,000 Cherokees from North Carolina, Georgia, and Tennessee over to what is present day Oklahoma. This took place between 1838 and 1839. Um, and yeah, today a Cherokee Indian reservation still exists in this region. And they, but the majority of Cherokee Indians do not want to live on the reservation and try to not be there as much as possible. So, not one of the best things that uh, in our history. Now, we do need to look at what was happening fiscally with Jackson, and then we'll be all set and done for the day. Give me 1 second here. So Jackson had fiscal problems with the National Bank and federal funds during his presidency. We're not going to go into all the details that go with this, but I do just kind of want you to know that this was an issue. And it was also a major campaign issue Jackson faced in re-election in 1832, the future of the Bank of the United States. Jackson had very little understanding of banking practices, and he just had a distaste for banks in general. But the Panic of 1819 was still a vivid and bitter memory in the West and South, and the bank was the culprit in the minds of the Americans. So in the summer of 1832, the president of the National Bank, Nicholas Biddle, submitted the bank's charter to Congress for a 20-year renewal, though the existing charter did not expire until 1836. When Jackson learned that this old political rival, Henry Clay, had instigated the early renewal of the charter, hoping that it would help him to be reelected as president, Jackson said, "That bank is trying to kill me, but I will kill it." And the bank had strong support in Congress. Um, Clay thought he was winning the campaign issue. The recharter bill passed Congress. Jackson vetoed it, claiming that it was unconstitutional. The Senate was unable to gain a two-thirds majority to override Jackson's veto, and thus the bank was to expire in 4 years. Um, so sorry. But that's not the end of the story. Clay, though the stage was now set for him to have a great victory, um, that wouldn't be the case. The election of 1832 introduced new political ideas. For the first time in a presidential election, we have a third party nominate a candidate. That third party was the Anti-Masonic Party, and it arose in oppositions to the Masons, which was a controversial secret society. It also opposed Catholic immigration and supported federal funding for internal improvements. Um, the party established two other traditions. It issued a platform, which is a written statement describing what the party stood for. And more importantly, it held a national convention where the state delegates gathered to nominate the party's presidential and vice presidential candidates. And the major parties quickly followed its example. And those two things have still stuck to this day. And both the Democrat and Republican parties have platforms and have national conventions in election years. So Henry Clay was chosen as the presidential candidate at the National Republican Convention, while President Jackson was chosen at the Democrat Convention. The election itself was not so interesting. Clay had miscalculated badly. Support in Congress for the bank and support in the countryside turned out to be two different things. Jackson swept to victory with his old ally, Van Buren, as his new vice president, and his reelection, having convinced him more than ever that he was the choice of the people, he turned his attention towards the bank. His term or his terms were unconditional surrender. He claimed that withdrawing federal funds from the bank would lessen the negative effects of the charter's expiration in 1836. Um, the two secretaries of the Treasury refused to remove the federal deposits. Jackson fired both and then appointed Roger B. Taney to be Treasury Secretary. And the next month, Taney began removing federal deposits and placing them in state banks, aka they were nicknamed Jackson's pet banks, as his enemies called them. The bank's defeat was not a victory for the common man or over the wealthy financiers, as Jackson claimed that it would be. Jackson's actions were a two-edged sword. The loss of the federal deposits in the Bank of the United States led the bank president to reduce the number of loans. As a result, fewer businesses could borrow money that they needed to expand. Some factories closed, and actually many workers lost their jobs. When businessmen urged Jackson to save the country from depression, he replied, "Go to Nicholas Biddle." Jackson blamed Biddle for the mounting problem, while Biddle said Jackson was at fault. And in 1836, when its charter expired, the Bank of the United States ceased to exist. And then, after Jackson's second term in office, we see that a new party comes again, and we see the Whig Party is created in response to Jackson's presidency. So, this anti Jackson force, despite their differing regions and interests and former political alliance, the Whigs didn't like Jackson, and that was what united them. Now, that name, Whigs, derives the name from a British party that traditionally opposed royal tyranny. So, Jackson's intimidating methods and manner um, was what they were against. So, it would end up being that. that the Whigs were a nationalist party, and they were so like kind of like federalist based, and the result was Van Buren would win the next election. And so Martin Van Buren had been Jackson's handpicked successor. So the Whigs did not win, but they did start to propagate a different idea. The Whigs definitely emphasized on opti optimism and opportunity, um, and they're going to attract people like Abraham Lincoln, William Seward, Horace Greeley. But Van Buren would have this election, but even though he was Jackson's VP, Van Buren, it seems true that opposites attract. Though they were both born in humble circumstances, they grew up in very different worlds. Jackson became a planter and an Indian fighter. Van Buren was a politician. He was polished, um, and they even looked very different. And so, although the two men differed in background, appearance, and temperament, Old Hickory owed the Little Magician, was his nickname, a great deal for his political skills in winning elections. So, it was Jackson's endorsement that was really the deciding vote for Van Buren's, um, that really helped Van Buren win the election. But right as Van Buren takes the office, the economy's going to collapse, and they're going to experience a 5-year depression known as the Panic of 1837. And banks and businesses failed, and unemployment grew across the nation. So, with that in mind, we kind of see through the 1830s and 1840s, harder economic times, as well as a lot of growth in American society, as far as a lot of people coming from different countries. We see a lot of technological growth. We we also see a lot of tension in society. And that is going to bring us to the Civil War. So we are going to actually take a jump here. We're going to go from the 1830s all the way to the 1860s. Um, and that's where I'm going to leave you today. Have a great day. I'll see you later.